Welcome to Asia Pacific Defense Reporter, your go-to source for cutting-edge security insights in the region. Get ready for rapid-fire analysis and commentary from the Asia Pacific with your host, Kim Bergman.
Hello and welcome back. Let's race through a few issues in this podcast because it's still very early in the term of this government. Ministers were only sworn in last week, and even though the defence side of things has remained stable, it's still a bit too early to be expecting any initiatives. Now, an early correction I have to make is that the role of Defence Industry Minister Pat Conroy has remained unchanged from the previous government. Last week, I noted that his ministerial title no longer included responsibility for capability delivery, and I was wondering aloud whether he might have been downgraded or whether it was an administrative oversight or a typo. And I'm pleased to say it was the latter. He still retains that role of capability development, which I think is good news because he understands the defence acquisition process far better than Richard Marles, whose precise area of expertise remains unclear despite being in the job for 3 years. And as I commented previously, we are in the highly unusual position of having second-term defence and defence industry ministers, which means they should be totally in control of their portfolios. And of course, we will be exploring what that means in future episodes. Now, the Canberra bubble rumour, it wasn't a Hotel Kingston Friday lunch rumour. I haven't done those for a couple of weeks. But a more general rumour is there could be scope for a departmental reorganisation, because when we look at the acquisition side of things, we have as separate entities the Australian Submarine Agency, which is struggling. I've touched on that in the past. The NSSG, the Naval Shipbuilding and Sustainment Group, which in early April lost its previous head, Jim McDowell, who had a very strong industry background. I'm not aware that that position has been filled. And by the way, prior to Jim, it was the group which so catastrophically mismanaged the Arafura OPV program, C-1180, what a disaster that was. Then on top of that group, we have the GWEO, the Guided Weapons and Explosive Ordnance Division, which is having some success, though I think could be going considerably faster. And then as well as that, there's of course the original Capability Acquisition and Sustainment Group, which is the direct successor of the old and unlamented Defence Materiel Organisation. Many people will remember that from about 10 years ago. So is there scope for all of this to be rationalised? Well, you would think so, with just all of these separate little empires. Though from my perspective, the most important thing of all in terms of structural change would be to bring back proper, thorough, rigorous internal contestability rather than just waving projects through, no matter how much they cost, no matter how little Australian industry capability they have embedded in them. I think another very major issue that will confront the government in the not-too-distant future, how they plan to respond if the US demands that defence expenditure go to 3% of GDP. And all of the signs are that Australia will be in the firing line. That's the benchmark for European countries, and I see no reason why Australia would be in a different position from that. The Trump administration, as I will go on to detail in a moment, appears to be totally ruthless, and they say what they mean. I have little doubt that they would see Australia at 2% of GDP as just being a bunch of absolute freeloaders. And even though we're throwing billions of dollars in the form of gifts to US defence industry through AUKUS Pillar 1, and we're important purchasers of US hardware through the Foreign Military Sales System, our percentage of GDP is, I would think from the Trump perspective, unacceptably low. I think they would see the Australian government as, a bunch of socialists who are wasting money on the NDIS and on subsidising pharmaceuticals and all of this left-wing stuff, where in fact they should be changing their budget priorities and spending more on military hardware. That's just my guess. I'll return to that in a moment. Now, another big decision coming up for this government at the end of this year, it'll be early next year, is a decision on the C-3000 general-purpose frigate Goat Rodeo, and I'll have a lot more to say about that in the coming weeks. That's, people might recall, that's a choice between the Japanese Megami upgraded frigate and from Japan, and Miko 200 from Germany. Right now, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is currently in Europe, had a meeting with the Pope, I think, and the EU has floated the possibility with him of formalising a defence cooperation relationship, something I thought that the Prime Minister seemed indifferent to. I was a bit taken back by that. Maybe it was the reporting. If so, he really might want to change his tune on that one. The EU has signed defence cooperation agreements in the last couple of years with Japan and the Republic of Korea, South Korea. I've read the Korean one, which was signed last year, and it's a perfectly sensible arrangement for increasing information sharing and cooperation. I can see no reason why Australia would not, as a matter of urgency, be trying to sign the same sort of thing with the EU. Now, hopping around, I've been depressed, but not really surprised, to be watching a lot of federal election analysis. For example, the Insiders program on the ABC last Sunday morning, favourite viewing of We Canberra Bubble people, and I was amazed how it totally ignored the Trump effect, even though we know it was instrumental in part, or a lot, of the fall of the support for the coalition. Everyone's aware of this. The coalition was in a strong position, around Christmas, New Year, lead of a couple of points in the polls, and then, as the antics of Trump increased, the support for the coalition started to fall, and then after the April the 2nd Liberation Day tariffs, it had a further fall and gave Labor a comfortable lead, which they managed to grow on throughout the rest of the election campaign. The analysis was so totally parochial, whether it was the coalition on nuclear energy or whether Labor was scoring points on some policy matters, completely ignoring the international dimension. Now, having been around politics for a while, I can say that to understand what motivates people precisely, you would have to interview all 18 million Australian voters and then rely on them to tell the full truth. But what we can say is simply that the Trump effect was a factor, as it was to an even greater extent in the Canadian election, when the Conservatives, who'd had a huge lead, saw that completely wiped out. So let's segue and talk a bit more about the unreliability of the US as an ally and the total refusal of Australian politicians to accept that fact. The view from Europe, people might want to know, is that NATO is dead. None of the European members of NATO, and certainly not Canada, another member, believe that the United States will live up to commitments contained in Article 5 of that agreement to respond in the case of aggression of an attack on any one of the members. That is over. NATO will continue as some sort of framework, some sort of talk fest, but I can assure people that all European countries are now having to prepare for the eventuality that they will not receive the support of the United States. As I've detailed at length, Ukraine is being sacrificed. And now, in fact, a very new development, even Israel seems to be in some difficulty with Trump keen to sign a nuclear deal with Iran. There's a bit more I'll say on this. And by the way, as far as I can tell, the government of Israel, which is the most extreme right wing in the country's history, appears to have completely lost its mind with the endless relenting assaults on Gaza. We are up to 53,000 dead, of whom 18,000 are children. We've got the possibility of people being starved to death, even though there's been some food will now be let in. There seems to be no end point to this madness. And I have to say, even amongst my Jewish friends, that they struggle to explain to me what this ongoing relentless bombardment and this huge loss of life is going to lead to. Anyway, to leave Israel, I understand it's a very controversial topic. We now have Qatar as part of the equation. Qatar, by the way, being close to Iran and a backer of Hamas, and the bizarre story of the gift, which has been highlighted by some sections of the media, of a luxury 747 jumbo jet to Donald Trump, which for the moment he's keen to accept. I'll give some more background on that. Now, on the US as a reliable ally, continuing just that theme, consider these recent developments, which were not touched on here at all because the media was completely preoccupied during the election campaign. The Trump administration stopped airstrikes on the Houthis, claiming they had negotiated an agreement with them to stop hitting US-flagged ships. But if the agreement does in fact exist, no one see it. All other ships are potential targets. The US has said, okay, we've looked after ourselves, the rest of you are on your own. Now, my view is that once Trump got around to asking how much the airstrikes are costing every day, he balked at that, not only at the cost of missiles, but there was extensive media coverage, which he would have seen on Fox News, of 2 Super Hornet aircraft going over the side of an aircraft carrier and sinking in the space of a couple of days. Moving on. Then the US is claiming that it has some form of negotiation with Hamas occurring, and indeed the last hostage, who was an American, has been released. That happened last week. Then there are some form of direct talks underway with Iran on some new style of deal to restrict Tehran's nuclear weapons program. Now, putting all of this together, the signals could not be clearer, unless you're a total idiot. The US is doing its own thing, with even Israel, as I say, potentially out in the cold. In the just concluded Trump Middle Eastern tour, Israel wasn't even on the list, possibly because it doesn't have palaces made out of marble and gold where he can be met by fawning, adoring courtiers. And since Donald Trump only likes winners and hates losers, it's possible that he has already lost interest in Gaza because that's proving too difficult to fix. He can't bulldoze it and build a whole lot of condos and get rid of the 2.2 million people who live there, just as Ukraine has proved that it's also too difficult to fix. But since I feel at this stage a bit of humour is needed, let's have a look at Qatar's proposed gift of the 747 to Trump. It has a stated value of 600 million Australian dollars. Now, most countries, including Australia, have strict limits on the value of gifts that politicians receive for the obvious reason that it's not a good idea for politicians to be bribed. Now, most gifts are harmless. The funniest one I ever saw was a giant Swiss cowbell presented to Kim Beazley when he was Defence Minister. It was so big that the cow would have had to have been about 5 metres tall, and most of them are just meant to be cute little mementos and trinkets. I note the current Defence Minister, Richard Marles, has a fondness for snow globes. There's no harm there. But a 747, that seems a bit rich, so to speak, especially since the one in question has been described as a flying palace or flying brothel, furnished in the style of Iraq's late dictator Saddam Hussein with gold, either real or fake, everywhere. And President Trump, who is obviously impressed by gold, he has redecorated the White House with gold paint and gold-coloured ornaments everywhere. He's even named the proposed and possibly unachievable continental missile defense umbrella Golden Dome. So he clearly wants to accept the gift of an aircraft, saying anyone who knocked back a free 747 was a fool. He is now trying to escape allegations of bribery by claiming the jet will be a gift to the US Department of Defense, not him, though clearly he will be its sole user, along with family members and the rest of his fawning, grovelling entourage. So let's have a look at the plane, which was one of two ordered by a Qatari billionaire around 2009-2010, and a huge amount of money was spent fitting out these two in the most extraordinary, lavish, over-the-top gold bling everywhere. But they have proven so expensive to operate and maintain that since the year 2020, Qatar has been trying to get rid of them. In fact, airliner number one, the best or worst of the two, depending on whether you think all of this gold stuff is in good taste, was palmed off to Turkish President Erdogan. So he has to bear the operating costs of it, because running a 747, and this is why they're being retired from commercial service, is about 35,000 Australian dollars per hour. They burn so much fuel, and they're hugely expensive to maintain. And I will say, it's said the poster child of these 747 disasters, with Middle Eastern royal families just going completely over the top, was the 747-8 series, similar to the one offered to Trump, for Saudi Crown Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Al Saud before his death in 2011. Now, this particular grotesque flying palace was scrapped for parts in 2022 with just 42 hours of flight time in 11 years. So you can see what's happening here. The Qataris have been trying to get rid of these hugely expensive things for ages. Now, they flew the particular jet in question to the US a few months ago and showed it to Donald Trump, who was clearly impressed by all of the bling, all of the outfitting. Now, they've offered to give it to him for as yet undefined favours, which could obviously involve things like a softer approach to both Hamas and Iran. Yet Donald Trump, despite the obvious conflict of interest, wants his gaudy gold interior luxury aircraft and may well figure out how to do it and remain within legal guidelines, though in the US, the Trump administration doesn't seem to care very much about those. So the point is, from a national security perspective, this is the ally to which Australian planners are so attached and cannot conceive of a world other than one in which we continue to fawn and grovel to whichever US administration is in power, no matter how grotesque and unpredictable their behaviour gets. So to return to one of the earlier themes, so I am very keen to understand what the reaction of this government is going to be when, rather than if, the US puts pressure on a lift in defence expenditure. And by the way, again, my impression and my US contacts, of whom I have a few, tell me that the administration will not at all be impressed by some sort of vague commitments to do this by the year 2035, or there's going to be this gradual escalation in effort. What they want to see is evidence of an increase, like right now, going ahead with a few shovel-ready projects like reviving Air 7003. There's quite a long shopping list. It could be done. It just needs the political will to make it happen. And the Americans are going to do some very, very heavy-duty arm twisting. We'll have a lot more to talk about in the next podcast. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye for now, and see you next time.
That's today's Asia Pacific Defence Reporter. For more in-depth articles, expert opinions, and exclusive interviews, visit AsiaPacificDefenceReporter.com. Stay informed, stay ahead. This is your source for all things defence. Until next time.